diversity, North America's strength or weakness. And the people we have to debate that topic are Jared Taylor. Mr. Taylor is an author and a speaker from Virginia. He's the editor of American Renaissance magazine, and on the web that's at amren.com. He's the president of the Century Foundation. That's the foundation that publishes American Renaissance magazine. The other debater is Peter March. Peter's a colleague of mine in the philosophy department at St. Mary's University. He's been there for a while. He's a noted Haligonian controversialist. The format of our, as well as a philosopher, the format of our discussion tonight is this. Each speaker will take 20 minutes to set out his views. Mr. Taylor will go first. After Professor March has spoken, Mr. Taylor will have 10 minutes, and then Peter March 10 minutes, and then 5 minutes each. That's how that's our format tonight. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd particularly like to thank Peter March for making this debate possible. As you just heard, the question before us is whether racial diversity is a strength or a weakness for North America. And for my learned opponent to make his case, he'll have to show that Canada and the United States have benefits, real, concrete, specific benefits they would not have without racial diversity. And I look forward to seeing what he actually comes up with. I have a considerably easier job. All I have to do is describe reality. And the reality is that racial diversity produces tension, conflict, and hostility. If racial diversity were a strength, people would be drawn to it naturally. They'd seek it out. If diversity were a strength, you would never have minority neighborhoods because people would mix. But they don't. Left to themselves, people seek out the company of people like themselves. Now, you may be surprised to know that virtually every institution in Canada actually agrees with me that racial diversity is a source of conflict. They don't use the word conflict. Instead, they use the word racism. Now, racism, they will tell you, is a terrible, terrible thing. And they will also tell you that Canada is riddled with it. Now, I would point out to you that racism can be a problem only when there is racial diversity. In a homogeneous country, people don't even think about race. It's only when people of different races mix that racism becomes a problem. So please, remember this. The next time you open your newspaper and you read about racism, racial profiling, racial discrimination, bigotry, hate, all of these words that we hear so frequently, you are not hearing a listing of the strengths of diversity. You're hearing a listing of the weaknesses of diversity. Now, racism is said to be so bad in Canada that every province and territory has at least 2 major bureaucracies to fight it: a Human Rights Commission and a Human Rights Tribunal. Then there is a Federal Human Rights Commission. There's the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, the National Anti-Racism Council of Canada, and countless city, local, and university bureaucracies, all trying to sniff out racism and fight it. Well, what are they doing? The Ontario Human Rights Commission says racial discrimination and racism are pervasive and continuing. The Canadian Commission for UNESCO says racism imperils democracy. The Federal Human Rights Commission says hate, and in particular its manifestation on the internet, pose a serious threat to the social fabric of Canadian society. Now, I ask you, how can racial diversity be a strength if it gives rise to something that imperils democracy, that poses a serious threat to the social fabric of Canadian society? And I'll be expecting an answer to that very question, Professor. Now, racism appears to be a huge worry right here in Halifax, where we're holding this debate. Just search the Dalhousie University website for racism, and you will get hundreds of pages of hits. Here are some of the results I got just a few days ago. Racism within the healthcare system, racism in the criminal justice system, the racism inherent in white civilization, racism in Shakespeare's The Tempest, everyday racism in medical school, the systemic racism that is prevalent in Nova Scotia, contemporary representations of racism in children's books, systemic racism in the Ontario criminal justice system. It goes on and on and on. By golly, racism is everywhere. And this is just a tiny sample of the hits on the webpage. I'd also add that a recent survey by Statistics Canada finds that no fewer than half of blacks in Canada say they have suffered from discrimination, racial discrimination. A third of South Asians and Chinese. Now, Statistics Canada never apparently asks whites whether they have been victims of racism. And a 2003 report on immigrants living in West Central Toronto found that no fewer than 68% had suffered housing discrimination alone, much less any other kind. I might add also that in 2004, the Dominion Institute, they did a big poll of Canadians. They found that 65% said that there had been no change in the level of racism in the last 5 years. 14% said there had been a decrease, but 17% said there had been an increase in racism in the last 5 years. I ask you, is Canada losing the fight against racism? Carol Tater, a Toronto-based academic, is quoted in the December 24th issue of the local paper here in Halifax, the Chronicle Herald, as saying, "The problem of racial profiling in Canada, both historically and currently, is a national crisis across the country." Likewise, right here in Nova Scotia, you have a Human Rights Commission. It sponsors what it calls meetings for champions of the workplace. These are discussions of, quote, challenges related to managing inclusion in the workplace. If diversity is a wonderful strength, why are there challenges? Why does it need to be managed? Why does it take a champion to get it right? In Nova Scotia, in fact, you have an entire ministry devoted to African Nova Scotians. If racial diversity is such a strength, why do you need a ministry devoted just to them? Now, there's one thing for sure about racial diversity. It means you've got to watch your language. Here in Nova Scotia, a case went all the way to the Supreme Court because one man liked to call all his friends Kimosabe. You'll recall that's what Lone Ranger called Tonto. Well, some Micmac Native American woman didn't like that. And the case went all the way to the Court of Appeals. The Human Rights Commission wanted to take it to the Supreme Court of Canada. For heaven's sake. Well, if that's what you get from a diverse workplace, no wonder it takes champions to get it right. Now, because of racial diversity, some Canadians can't even describe what's going on right before their very noses. In 2004, a Toronto City Councilman named Mike Delgrand told his local paper that Chinese were moving into his ward and that white people were moving out. Well, apparently to make such a bald and obvious statement was racism. Mr. Delgrand had to apologize. He said, quote, "I should have said many older residents of the community were moving out. I didn't say it in a politically correct way." Now, a city councilman can't even state a plain fact for fear of bruising someone's feelings. Doesn't sound like a strength to me. But bruised feelings and mutual incomprehension appear to be an inevitable part of diversity. The Supreme Court of Canada had to take up the question of whether Sikh students were allowed to carry ceremonial daggers to school with them. The Montreal School Board didn't like the idea of students running around with knives, but the Supreme Court said, of course they can. It's a matter of religious freedom. And did you know that in 2005, the Canadian Justice Department funded a $150,000 study on polygamy? You know what its conclusion was? It was that there are already so many polygamous people in Canada that we had better legalize polygamy. Once again, I ask you, do bigamists and school children with knives, do they make Canada a better place? These questions wouldn't arise without diversity. Now, the vice principal of Queen's University, Patrick Dean, may be onto something. Recently he said this, quote, "Our Canadian culture has been squeamish about gathering race-based statistics because no one wants to see ethnic makeup reduced to numbers on a page. But unless you get this kind of information, you don't really know if you have a problem." Well, I would suggest to you this. Canada does have a problem. It just doesn't want to know about it. And that's why you don't have statistics on racial differences in crime rates, illegitimacy, poverty, disease, welfare use. Now, these would be useful things to know if anyone really wanted to know whether racial diversity is a strength for Canada. Of course, we get hints about crime, at any rate, from the press. The Canadian Press of December 24th, 2005. I quote, "Almost 100 men in rival Indo-Canadian gangs in Vancouver have been murdered since 1994, often execution style, over drug deals gone wrong. Toronto's gang violence, on the other hand, often involves gun-wielding young black men. Of the more than 70 murders in the Toronto area so far this year, as many as 30 were in the black community, and many others among Asians, Latino, and Tamil gangs," said Tony War, Toronto's deputy police chief. Here's Globe and Mail of October 17th, 2005, telling you that on a per capita basis, Winnipeg has become the murder capital of Canada. Once again, I quote, "Most of the victims of violent crime are Aboriginals, third world immigrants, gang members, homeless people, or transients. And Winnipeg's West End has long been in thrall to a gang known as the Mad Cows, made up mostly of young African immigrants." Here's the Vancouver paper, The Province, October 21st, 2005. They say, "A violent ethnic war between Filipino and Vietnamese youths in the Lower Mainland will likely escalate." Then, March 16, 2006, in the Calgary Sun. Headline is, "Feared Gang Hits Calgary." Are we talking about dangerous white people here? No. It's a gang from Central America, El Salvador, called MS-13, More Racial Diversity. In 2005, black violence in Toronto got so bad that one city councilman, Michael Thompson, said, "Police should pull over black people absolutely at random and search them for weapons. Racial profiling 100%. Was he hounded out of polite society? Well, no. He has protective coloring. He's black, you see. But he had perhaps an insider's view as to what the problem might be." Now, I will tell you, the United States is not too squeamish to collect statistics on race. And we know that when it comes to violent crime, blacks commit them at 10 to 15 times the white rate. Hispanics commit violent crime at 3 to 4 times the white rate. I suspect that you would have differentials equal to that here in Canada, but apparently you don't want to know. Now, we find a particularly fascinating diversity issue in the case of Toronto's now defunct zero-tolerance policy. Apparently, students in Toronto schools were committing so much robbery, drug dealing, sexual assault, weapons violations, that in 2000, the province passed the Safe Schools Act, requiring that any student who committed these crimes be either expelled or suspended. Well, just 4 years later, this policy had to be junked. Why? Because non-whites, in particular blacks, were being expelled and suspended way out of proportion to their numbers. Now, this story eliminates two things. First, we learn that the problem was largely non-whites. It was they who were being suspended and expelled. Second, a sensible, non-discriminatory policy had to be junked because non-whites were affected disproportionately. So here we have a situation in which racial diversity both caused the problem and made it impossible to implement a sensible solution. And while we're on the subject of Toronto schools, in 2005, a black school board member, Lloyd McKell, proposed that it might be necessary to set up all black schools because integrated schools were failing blacks. Too many dropouts, too many expulsions. And just last April, right here in Halifax, a black educator named Wade Smith recommended the same thing. Integrated schools are doing such a poor job for blacks that he wanted a school just for blacks. Now, I thought that segregation was bad for blacks. Now, apparently, black people are telling us integration is bad for blacks. It certainly sounds as though racial diversity is a mighty tricky business. Back to Toronto. In 2005, a coalition of 22 black community groups, well, hold on, let's stop right there. A coalition of 22 black community groups? What do all these groups do? Why do they need to be 22 of them? Why are they all exclusively black? Do their members all sit around and celebrate the strengths of diversity? I suspect not. But let's continue with this story. A